Georgia, 1847. The afternoon air inside the plantation house was thick and unmoving, the kind that made every sound feel louder than it should. Sarah stood just inside the doorway of the master's study, hands folded neatly in her apron. Her voice was steady but careful. "Sir, would you like me to dust the files today?" He did not look up. His pen continued scratching across the paper, slow, firm, controlled. "No, leave them." The response was quick, too quick. For 12 years she had cleaned this room, polished the mahogany desk, emptied the ash from the fireplace, washed the ink from his glass pens. But lately, something had changed. Letters had begun arriving with foreign seals pressed deep into red wax. At night, she heard pacing above her quarters. And more than once, she had watched him burn documents before sunrise. That afternoon, as she bent beside his chair, her fingers brushed against the edge of a loose floorboard. A hollow sound answered her touch. He stood suddenly. "That will be all." His voice carried something new. Fear. Later, when the house fell silent, she returned. And what she uncovered beneath that floor would not only expose her master's secret, it would destroy the very idea of who truly owned that plantation. If you value stories that uncover the hidden truths of our past, I invite you to subscribe and join us for more historical revelations. Georgia, 1847. The sun rose slowly over the cotton fields, spreading a pale gold light across rows that seemed to stretch without end. From a distance, the plantation looked orderly, predictable, blessed. Mist clung low to the earth, curling around the ankles of the men and women already bent at the waist before the morning bell had fully faded. The rhythm of picking began early, the soft pull of cotton from burr, the creak of wicker baskets, the quiet exchange of breath. And above it all, on horseback, rode the master. He sat tall in the saddle, gloved hands resting easy on the reins. His coat was pressed, his boots polished to a dark shine. The overseer walked several paces behind, hat in hand, waiting for instruction. The master did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A slight turn of his head, a narrowing of the eyes, a gesture toward a distant row. That was enough. The overseer would move, orders would be carried out, and the field would continue its steady labor under the unblinking Georgia sky. From where Sarah stood at an upstairs window of the great house, she could see all of it. The fields, the workers, the white columns of the house reflecting morning light. To anyone passing along the dirt road beyond the gates, it was a picture of authority, stability, success. The great house stood high on its foundation, painted white each spring without fail. Its shutters were dark and symmetrical, its wide porch wrapped around like an embrace of confidence. Inside, imported rugs from Charleston softened the hardwood floors. A grandfather clock from Boston marked each passing hour with solemn dignity. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. Inside, Sarah moved quietly from room to room. She had served in that house for 12 years, long enough to know which stair creaked, which window stuck in humid weather, which cabinet the master preferred his imported brandy stored in. She polished the silver each morning until she could see her reflection in it, distorted but present. The chandeliers above caught that shine and scattered it across the dining room walls in tiny, dancing lights. Visitors used to fill that room. Laughter once echoed beneath those ceilings. Politicians, neighboring planters, traveling businessmen, they had gathered around long tables heavy with roasted meats and sugared fruits. The master would stand at the head of it all, wineglass raised, speaking of yields and expansion and the promise of the Southern economy. He spoke like a man building an empire, and the others believed him. Sarah remembered the sound of it, the clinking glasses, the confident predictions, the way men nodded when he described purchasing more acreage by the following year. But lately, the dining room had grown quiet. The chairs sat empty longer than they were occupied. Dust gathered more quickly on the far end of the table. Fewer carriages arrived at the circular drive. At first, she thought nothing of it. Seasons shifted, markets rose and fell, planters traveled. But then she noticed something else. One afternoon, she was instructed to wrap a set of sterling serving trays in linen. They were not being cleaned. They were being removed. "Send them to town," the master told her without meeting her eyes. "They'll fetch a fair price." A fair price. She said nothing, but she had never known him to sell silver. Not after boasting that each piece had been imported from New Orleans at considerable cost. Weeks later, 2 decorative vases disappeared from the hallway table. Then a Persian rug from the sitting room. Always quietly, always explained away. Rearranging, updating, making space. Yet nothing new replaced what was gone. Still, in the fields, nothing appeared different. The overseer cracked his whip when necessary. Wagons of cotton rolled toward the gin. Bales were stacked and stamped for shipment downriver. Outwardly, production continued. Outwardly, the master rode his horse each morning with the same rigid posture. Outwardly, the hierarchy held firm. But inside the house, something subtle had shifted. At night, Sarah began to hear pacing overhead. Not the slow, measured steps of a man preparing for rest. These were restless, back and forth, sometimes until well past midnight. More letters began arriving. Not the friendly correspondence she once carried in on silver trays. These bore thick paper and unfamiliar seals, pressed deep in red wax with emblems she did not recognize. The handwriting on the envelopes was tight, formal, foreign. He no longer opened them in the sitting room. He took them straight to his study. And the study door, once often left ajar, now remained firmly closed. Each morning, Sarah entered that room after he rode out to the fields. The air inside was different, heavier. The scent of burned paper lingered in the fireplace. More than once, she found the ashes still warm. Whatever those letters contained, he did not wish them kept. The desk itself had changed, too. Where it once held neatly stacked ledgers and correspondence arranged with pride, it now bore scattered papers, hastily folded documents, ink stains that had not been properly blotted. The master had always prided himself on order, precision. Now the edges of that precision were fraying. One evening, as she passed the hallway outside his study, she heard his voice, low, urgent. He was alone, yet he spoke as if answering someone. "I assure you the harvest will improve," he muttered. A pause. "The shipment is delayed, not diminished." Another pause. "I only require time." Time. The word lingered in the dim corridor long after his voice fell silent. Sarah did not understand the contents of those conversations, but she understood tone, and she had never heard that tone from him before. It was not the voice he used in the fields, not the voice he used at dinner tables, not the voice that issued commands without hesitation. This voice carried something unfamiliar, strain, and beneath it, fear. Still, each morning he mounted his horse. Each afternoon, the overseer took orders. Each evening, the lamps in the great house were lit on schedule. To the outside world, the plantation stood as a monument to Southern power. The cotton rows were straight. The house remained white. The master's posture remained tall. But in the quiet corners of that study, beneath the polished mahogany desk, beneath the burned letters and disappearing silver, an invisible pressure was building. And though the workers in the fields felt the weight of chains they could see, there was something else tightening within those white walls, something unseen. From the outside, he ruled everything the sun touched. Inside that study, something else ruled him. That night, the house did not sleep. Wind pressed gently against the tall windows, carrying with it the distant scent of damp soil and crushed cotton. The lanterns in the hallway had long since been lowered. Doors were shut. The long case clock marked each passing minute with solemn indifference. Sarah lay still in her small quarters behind the kitchen wing. She waited. She had learned long ago that patience was safer than curiosity. But that hollow sound beneath the study floor would not leave her thoughts. The loose board, the way it shifted beneath her fingers, the sharpness in the master's voice when he dismissed her. She listened. Upstairs, footsteps moved once more across the study floor, back and forth, back and forth. Then, silence. A door opened, closed. Moments later, she heard the faint echo of boots crossing the gravel outside. He was riding again. Late. Too late for inspection. She rose slowly. The hallway was dark except for the faint blue wash of moonlight slipping through tall windows. Every step she took was measured. She knew which planks protested and which stayed quiet. When she reached the study door, she paused. Her hand hovered over the knob. She was not meant to enter that room alone at night. But she turned it anyway. The door opened with a soft breath. Inside, the air was thick with extinguished candle smoke. The desk stood in shadow, its polished surface dull without flame to catch it. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she did nothing. She listened. The house held its silence. Slowly, she crossed to the desk and knelt beside the chair. Her fingers searched along the floorboards until they found it again. The slight, uneven edge. She pressed gently. The board lifted, not easily, but enough. Beneath it lay a narrow, hollow space carved between support beams, and inside that space was a book. It was wrapped in plain cloth, tied with a thin cord. The fabric was worn at the corners, as if handled often but hidden carefully. Her hands hesitated. If he kept it here, beneath his own feet, it was not meant for anyone else to see. Her breath felt shallow as she lifted it out. The book was heavier than she expected. Leather-bound, dark brown, unmarked on the cover. No title, no decoration. Just weight. She moved closer to the desk where moonlight gave her enough visibility to see. Her fingers trembled as she untied the cord. For years, she had watched him maintain ledgers openly on that desk, listing crop tallies, supply inventories, and, occasionally, valuations of enslaved men and women. She expected this book to be similar. Perhaps names, ages, market values, transactions. She had seen her own name written once in ink beside a number. She braced herself for that again. She opened the cover. The first page was not what she expected. There were no names of field hands, no ages, no descriptions. Instead, columns. Carefully ruled lines, dates stretching back several years, and beside those dates, sums, large sums. She leaned closer. £12,000, London Agricultural Finance. The symbol was unfamiliar, but she had seen it on those sealed letters before. More entries followed. £8,500, extension of prior note, interest accrued, 6% quarterly. Her breath caught. These were not records of ownership. They were records of borrowing. Page after page detailed money received, money owed, payment schedules, interest percentages increasing when deadlines were missed. And there, written clearly beneath each agreement, her master's signature. Full name, precise, binding. She turned another page. The handwriting changed. Different ink, different style, formal, sharp. Notice of delayed remittance. Final courtesy before penalty. Collateral to be reviewed in absence of compliance. Collateral. She scanned downward. The word appeared again and again. Then she saw it. Primary security. Whitfield Plantation inclusive of structures, acreage, and productive assets. Productive assets. Her hand tightened around the edge of the page. The plantation itself, listed as security against debt. She flipped further. The entries grew more urgent, payments postponed, interest compounding, amounts swelling beyond the original loans. And tucked between two pages, a folded letter. She hesitated before unfolding it. The paper was creased sharply from being read and reread. She smoothed it gently and began to read by moonlight. To the esteemed gentleman of Ashford and Blythe Banking House, London. Her master's handwriting, less steady than usual. I assure you that the upcoming harvest will exceed prior estimates. Recent setbacks have been temporary in nature. Temporary. I respectfully request an extension of 90 days before enforcement of the agreed measures. She swallowed. Enforcement. Another letter followed. I understand your position and remain committed to honoring all obligations. Obligations. The words did not sound like a ruler. They sounded like a man pleading. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Confidence turning into justification. Justification turning into desperation. The tone shifted over time. Early letters spoke of expansion, future acquisitions, rising markets. Later letters spoke of weather, shipping delays, market fluctuations. And finally, time. Always time. Her mind raced. If the plantation was collateral, if the house was security, if the land itself was pledged, then what did that mean? She turned to a page near the back, a summary. Total outstanding balance, interest accumulated, penalties projected. The number was staggering. She could not fully grasp its scale. But she understood enough. It was larger than anything that could be paid in one harvest, or two, or perhaps ever. And beneath that total, a clause. In the event of default, all assets, inclusive of land, structures, equipment, and labor holdings, shall be subject to transfer or liquidation at discretion of creditor. Labor holdings. Her chest tightened. That phrase reduced human lives to accounting language. But what unsettled her most was not the cruelty of it. It was the realization beneath it. He had always spoken as if the land were his birthright, as if the house had grown from his own hands, as if the people who labored in the fields existed solely under his authority. But these pages told another story. He did not stand alone at the top. He stood in the middle. Above him, yes, but beneath someone else. Men in London. Men who had likely never stepped foot in Georgia soil. Men who held paper instead of whips. Men who could seize everything with ink instead of force. She sat back on her heels. The study felt smaller now. The desk less imposing. The silence heavier. For years she had believed the master untouchable, his word final, his authority absolute. Yet here in her trembling hands lay proof that he answered to distant signatures and foreign seals. That the great house, so white and proud beneath the sun, was not entirely his. That even the ground beneath its pillars had been promised to unseen creditors. She imagined those men reading his letters across an ocean, weighing his worth in numbers, calculating his failures, reducing him to columns of debt just as he reduced others to columns of value. The irony pressed against her like the humid Georgia air. He commanded the fields by day and begged for mercy by night. Her eyes drifted to the door. If he returned now, if he found her kneeling with that ledger open, there would be no explanation she could offer, no forgiveness extended. Because this book did not merely contain numbers. It contained truth. And truth in that house was more dangerous than disobedience. She carefully refolded the letters, closed the ledger, retied the cord with unsteady fingers. For a long moment she held it against her lap. The weight of it felt different now, heavier than leather and paper. It carried the collapse of illusion. Slowly, she slid it back beneath the floor, replaced the board, pressed it flat. When she rose, her knees felt weak. The study appeared unchanged. The desk stood tall, the fireplace cold. The portraits along the walls watched in silent judgment. To anyone entering that room at sunrise, nothing would seem different. But everything had changed. Because now she knew. The master who rode across the fields each morning, the man who spoke of ownership as if it were divine, the man who decided the fate of every soul on that land, did not own what he claimed. He had pledged it, signed it, borrowed against it, and perhaps already lost it. She reached for the door and paused. One final thought settled into her mind, clear and unshakable. The man who claimed to own her did not own the land beneath his own house. After the night she found the ledger, Sarah began to see the plantation differently. Nothing outward had changed. The bell still rang before dawn. The field hands still moved in long, bending rows. The overseer still carried his authority like a weapon strapped visibly at his side. And the master still rode, boots polished, hat brim low, posture straight against the rising Georgia sun. But now, when Sarah watched him from the upstairs window, she no longer saw a ruler surveying his kingdom. She saw a man measuring inventory. There was calculation in his gaze. When he counted the rows of cotton, he was not admiring the land. He was assessing yield. When he pressed the overseer for speed, it was not pride driving him. It was schedule. Deadlines inked in London. She had read the dates. She knew when payments were due. And as the weeks passed, she noticed how often his eyes drifted toward the horizon. Not as if guarding territory, but as if waiting for something to arrive, or fearing that it would. The realization settled into her slowly. The master was not the top of the pyramid. He stood in its center. Above him, unseen but powerful, were men who did not carry whips. They carried contracts. Far across the Atlantic, in buildings of brick and stone, investors sat at polished desks much like his. They studied reports sent from plantations like this one. They reviewed figures, rainfall estimates, shipping manifests. To them, Whitfield Plantation was not a home. It was an entry, an asset line, a revenue stream. She imagined them unfolding his letters, calculating risk, weighing his performance. They had never felt Georgia heat, never heard the crack of an overseer's command, never smelled cotton dust clinging to skin. Yet their signatures carried authority greater than his, because their ink determined whether this plantation lived or died. And it was not just land pledged to them, it was everything. The ledger had shown her that insurance policies were attached to human lives, names reduced to age brackets, strength categorized, value estimated based on productivity and health. If a man in the field collapsed from heat, there was paperwork for that. If a woman bore a child, there was valuation for that too. Every body on the land had been converted into a number long before Sarah ever touched the silver in the dining room. She remembered a particular page, a section listing insured labor assets. The language had been clinical, detached. In case of loss, compensation shall be rendered to offset decline in productive output. Loss. As if a human life were a damaged shipment. She thought of the master reading those policies, signing them, agreeing to terms that treated flesh as collateral. Yet in doing so, he had bound himself tighter to those same distant men, because the policies did not protect the enslaved, they protected the investors. Every whip crack in the field ensured production. Every production report ensured continued credit, and continued credit ensured his survival. He was not preserving tradition. He was servicing debt. The cotton itself was no longer simply harvested. It was promised before it bloomed. She had seen entries referencing forward contracts, cotton futures sold months in advance, shipments pledged against loans not yet paid. The harvest belonged to someone else long before the first bowl opened, which meant the pressure in his voice was not merely temper. It was arithmetic. If the fields underperformed, the interest compounded. If rain came too hard or too little, penalties followed. The plantation operated not on soil alone, but on borrowed time. Sarah began to notice patterns. When clouds gathered thick and gray above the fields, the master did not merely watch the sky. He calculated delay. When wagons broke down, he did not curse inconvenience. He measured loss. And when a man in the field slowed from exhaustion, the overseer's lash fell not simply to assert dominance, but to protect margin. It was a brutal equation. Cruelty translated into cash flow, fear converted into shipment stability. She had once believed the master's authority was rooted in pride. Now she saw it was rooted in obligation. One afternoon, she passed his study door while carrying fresh linens. It was slightly ajar. Inside, he sat hunched over the desk. No guests, no brandy, just paper. His coat lay discarded over a chair. His sleeves were rolled back. Ink stained his fingers. He paused mid-sentence, staring at the page as though the words would not come easily. Then he dipped the pen again and continued writing. I remain confident that this season's yield shall correct prior deficiencies. Deficiencies. He stopped again, pressed his fingers to his temple. The man who commanded dozens trembled before a blank sheet of paper. The contrast struck her like a blow. That morning she had watched him discipline a young field hand for failing to meet quota. The boy had not looked older than 16. The master's voice had been cold, unyielding. Production must not decline. Now, in the dim study light, that same man chose his words carefully, almost humbly. He wrote to men who could ruin him without stepping foot on his land. He signed each letter with courtesy, with respect, with submission hidden beneath formality. Sarah understood something then that she had never considered before. Power was layered. In the fields, he stood at the top. In the study, he stood below. And above him were others still, a chain stretching across oceans, each link dependent on the one beneath it. The enslaved bore visible chains of iron. He bore invisible chains of interest. And unlike iron, interest tightened over time. She wondered if he ever resented them, those distant men in London, if he cursed their demands after sealing his envelopes, or if he accepted his role fully, believing himself still superior because he stood one rung higher than those he oppressed. Perhaps that was the design, to give a man just enough authority to feel powerful, while ensuring he never escaped his own obligations. The plantation was not a kingdom. It was a branch office. The great house was not a throne. It was collateral. And the master was not a sovereign. He was a manager. A debt-ridden figurehead maintaining discipline to keep payments flowing upward. Each whip crack in the field ensured interest payments overseas. Each enforced silence preserved investor confidence. He enforced chains he could see, while tightening chains he could not. And somewhere beyond the Georgia horizon, men who had never touched cotton adjusted their ledgers and waited. Because eventually, creditors do not wait forever. The missed payment came quietly. There was no thunder, no dramatic announcement, just a date that passed, without money following it. Sarah knew the date before he did. She had memorized it from the ledger. The ink had been darker beside that entry, underlined. Quarterly interest due. She watched him that morning from the upstairs window as he unfolded the latest letter. He did not open it immediately. He held it in his hand longer than usual, studying the seal as if it might soften under his gaze. London. The wax cracked beneath his thumb. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slower, then back again. His jaw tightened. The letter trembled almost imperceptibly between his fingers. He folded it once, twice, slipped it into his coat pocket, and mounted his horse without a word. But that evening he did not ride the fields. He rode nowhere. He remained inside the study. The decanter on his desk emptied faster than usual. The sound of glass meeting wood echoed more frequently through the hallway. The pacing returned, not measured, not controlled, restless. Sarah passed by the door carrying a tray and heard him speaking aloud again, but this time there was no effort to sound composed. "They have no understanding of conditions here," he muttered, as if harvest obeys calendar ink. "I have given them assurances." Assurances. The word felt smaller now. The next morning, a second letter arrived, thicker, stamped more heavily. The overseer delivered it himself, hat in hand, eyes lowered. The master opened it in full view of the porch this time. Perhaps he hoped to appear unbothered, but Sarah stood just inside the doorway and saw the shift. His shoulders lowered slightly. His face paled beneath the sun. He did not finish reading it outside. He retreated to the study. The door shut harder than usual. That night, no pacing, no muttering, only silence. The kind of silence that presses against walls. Days passed. The tension settled into the house like dust no cloth could wipe away. The master drank earlier in the afternoons. The overseer received sharper instructions. Quotas increased. Punishments grew less patient. It was as though he believed force could compensate for arithmetic, as though fear in the fields might translate into relief overseas. But cotton did not grow faster because a man shouted, and rain did not fall on command. Then one morning, before the bell had rung, a carriage appeared at the front gate. It was not familiar, not the polished kind that carried neighboring planters, not the modest wagon of a local merchant. This carriage was simple, functional. Its wheels carried the dust of long travel. Two men stepped down. They wore dark coats despite the Georgia heat. Their boots were not muddied from fields. Their hands were clean. One carried a leather case. The other held folded documents secured with ribbon. They were not soldiers. They were not rivals. They did not look like men who required force. They looked like men who required signatures. Sarah watched from the upstairs landing as the master stepped onto the porch. He adjusted his coat, straightened his spine, assumed the posture he wore in public. The men removed their hats politely. One spoke first. Mr. Whitfield. No title beyond his name, no deference beyond custom. The master's reply was measured. You have come a considerable distance. Yes, sir. We represent Ashford and Blythe. The name seemed to tighten the air itself. The master's fingers flexed once at his side. I am aware of your representation. Then you are aware of our purpose. There was no accusation in the man's tone, only fact. They were invited inside, not warmly, but formally. The study door closed. Sarah moved closer down the hallway, careful not to be seen. Inside, voices remained low, controlled, at first. Papers rustled, the leather case snapped open, documents slid across the desk. We have allowed for prior extensions, one man said evenly. We have reviewed your most recent correspondence, said the other. And the harvest? The master asked. Below projection. A pause. The interest? Compounded as agreed. The master's voice sharpened. You cannot expect payment beyond what the land can yield. We expect compliance with signed obligation. Signed obligation. The words echoed differently when spoken by someone else. More pages turned. The plantation was pledged as primary security. I am aware of the terms. And the terms have matured. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah pressed her back against the wall, straining to hear. The master spoke again, lower now. You would not dismantle an operation mid-season. We would protect our investment. Investment. The word reduced everything to its simplest meaning. The man did not speak of families, or tradition, or Southern legacy. They spoke of numbers, columns, risk exposure. The master's voice rose then. For years, this estate has produced reliably. And for years, came the reply, it has been leveraged accordingly. Leveraged. There it was, the truth laid bare in daylight. The great house, the fields, the barns, the very soil, all pledged against sums that now stood unpaid. We are authorized, one man continued, to initiate protective measures. Paper slid forward. Ink glistened faintly where signatures would be required. What measures? The master demanded. Temporary oversight. Asset review. Preparation for liquidation if recovery proves unlikely. Liquidation. Sarah closed her eyes. The word carried finality. It did not mean negotiation. It meant conversion. Land into money. Buildings into balance sheets. Human lives into saleable entries. The master's chair scraped sharply against the floor. I will not surrender my estate to distant accountants. You surrendered it, the man replied calmly. When you pledged it. The truth landed without anger, without insult. Just fact. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the master's voice wavered. You would strip me of what is mine. We would reclaim what secures our capital. There was no cruelty in their tone, no satisfaction, only process. They were not here to dominate. They were here to settle accounts. Hours later, the men exited the study. The master followed behind them, face drained of color. In his hand was a single sheet of paper, stamped, sealed. The men returned to their carriage without ceremony. No raised voices, no spectacle, just departure. But by the following week, notices appeared, posted discreetly in town, then more publicly. Whitfield Plantation, assets under review, potential auction pending resolution of outstanding obligations. The word spread quietly at first. Neighbors visited less. Conversations shortened. The master drank openly now, no longer waiting for evening. The overseer asked fewer questions. And inside the study, more papers arrived. Not requests this time, not negotiations. Confirmations, valuations, inventory assessments, lists, the same kind of lists he had once kept of others. Now his name appeared on them. He was categorized, evaluated, reduced. His land measured in acreage, his output assessed against deficit, his worth translated into deficit projection. He who had valued human lives in columns now found himself entered into one. Sarah saw him one evening seated alone at the desk. The ledger lay open, not hidden beneath the floor, open, exposed. He stared at the final column. Total due. Beneath it, in smaller script, recovery insufficient. The phrase lingered in the air. Insufficient. For years he had judged others by sufficiency. Strong enough, productive enough, profitable enough. Now he sat beneath the same scrutiny and by the same logic. He did not measure up. The plantation continued to operate for the moment. The fields still produced, the bell still rang. But something irreversible had occurred. The illusion had fractured, not with violence, but with ink. The master who once stood at the top of visible power now waited for instructions from men who never raised their voices. And in the quiet of that study, staring at numbers he could no longer command. He understood something he had never permitted himself to consider. He was not untouchable. He was not sovereign. He was collateral. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be valued and found insufficient. After the notices appeared in town, something inside the great house shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. Sarah felt it first in the quiet. The master no longer paced at night. He sat, long hours in the study, sometimes with the ledger open, sometimes simply staring at the desk where so many confident letters had once been written. The fields still moved at dawn, the overseer still barked instructions, but there was hesitation now, subtle, almost imperceptible. Authority without certainty has a different sound. It cracks at the edges. Sarah continued her work as she always had, polishing silver, sweeping corridors, lighting lamps. Yet her thoughts no longer moved the way they once had. For years she had believed the hierarchy was solid as brick. God above, master beneath him, overseer beneath the master, and herself at the bottom, fixed in place. But the ledger had rearranged that order in her mind. His cruelty had been real. She had seen it. He had enforced labor without mercy. He had separated families without pause. He had valued bodies in numbers. Nothing in those pages erased that truth. Yet those same pages revealed something else. His power was not absolute. It was borrowed, leased, conditioned upon performance. He had been permitted authority as long as he produced, as long as the cotton flowed, as long as interest was paid. The moment production faltered, the tone of the letters changed, and so did his standing. She remembered the day the men from London returned. This time they did not enter as guests. They entered as supervisors. The ledger was no longer hidden beneath the floor. It lay openly on the desk, pages marked, totals circled. The master stood while they remained seated. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. He answered questions. He did not ask them. How soon can assets be liquidated if required? We will require a complete accounting of labor capacity. Current valuation must reflect declining output. Labor capacity. Declining output. They spoke of people the way he once had, measured, categorized, reduced. And he listened. For the first time, Sarah saw him swallow his pride, not in public, not before the fields, but before men who never raised their voices. That was when the final illusion dissolved. He was not a king defending his throne. He was a manager defending a contract. The plantation had never truly been his kingdom. It had been a node in a larger machine, a machine powered by credit, by risk, by speculation on crops not yet grown. And that machine consumed without sentiment. It consumed soil. It consumed labor. And now it was consuming him. Sarah began to understand something deeper. The system that chained her wrists had also wrapped itself around his future. Her chains were iron, heavy, visible. They bruised skin. They restricted movement. His chains were ink and interest. Invisible, but tightening. They restricted decisions. They narrowed options. They dictated behavior. If he failed to meet quotas, punishment came, not in the form of lashes, but in the form of seizure. Reputation stripped, land removed, standing erased. Both of them lived inside boundaries drawn by forces larger than either could see clearly. That truth did not soften her view of him. It did not excuse the whip. It did not heal wounds, but it changed the shape of her understanding. One evening, she stood again at the upstairs window. The cotton fields stretched outward, as they always had. But they no longer looked endless. They looked temporary. The master rode slower now, not inspecting, not commanding, just riding, as if memorizing what might soon no longer be his. The overseer's voice carried less force. Rumors had begun to circulate. Auction, transfer, new ownership. The enslaved whispered at night. Some feared being sold farther south. Others dared not imagine change at all. Sarah held her knowledge close. She alone, perhaps, understood the full architecture of what was unfolding. The house had not been built solely on land and labor. It had been built on leverage, on borrowed capital crossing oceans, on signatures exchanged in rooms far removed from Georgia heat. The men in London would never see the faces affected by their decisions. They would see columns, returns, loss mitigation. But their reach extended into every field, every cabin, every corner of the great house. It was not simply one man who held the whip. It was a structure, layered, interlocked, self-protecting. And when pressure increased at the top, it forced cruelty downward. He had tightened discipline not from strength, but from fear. Fear of numbers, fear of deficiency, fear of being deemed insufficient. The irony did not escape her. He had once told a young field hand, "You are worth only what you produce." Now the same principle hovered over him. He was worth only what he could deliver, and he was failing to deliver enough. One afternoon she entered the study to find him seated motionless. No drink, no pen, just silence. The ledger lay closed. His hand rested on top of it as if it were something alive. He did not look at her when she began dusting the shelves, but he spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "They will not remember what was built here," he said. "They will remember only what was owed." She paused. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging reality aloud. He had spent years believing the plantation defined him. Now he understood it had defined his debt. And debt does not preserve legacy. It extracts it. Within months, partial liquidation began. Equipment was sold, livestock transferred, land parcels divided. The great house stood for a time, but hollowed. Rooms emptied, furniture removed. The silver she had polished for years vanished completely. Even the chandeliers were lowered carefully and carried away. Each removal felt like a quiet undoing of pride. On the day the master signed the final transfer documents, Sarah watched from the hallway. His hand did not tremble this time. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if the act were inevitable. When the pen lifted from paper, something ended. Not with fire, not with violence, but with compliance. He stepped outside afterward and stood alone on the porch. The fields remained. The sky remained. But ownership had shifted, and he knew it. For the first time, perhaps in his life, he felt what it meant to be assessed and found lacking, measured, reduced, reassigned. He had enforced chains he could see, while tightening chains he could not. Now those invisible chains had pulled, and they had pulled hard enough to break the illusion. As for Sarah, the ledger did not set her free. The transfer of ownership did not dissolve her bondage overnight. Systems do not collapse cleanly. They evolve, They reassemble, they change names. But something inside her had shifted permanently. She no longer saw power as singular. She saw it as layered. She saw how authority can be both exercised and endured, how cruelty can flow downward while pressure flows upward, how a man may dominate those beneath him while answering to forces above him. Years later, when she thought back to that night beneath the floorboards, she did not remember only the numbers. She remembered the realization that the world she inhabited was constructed not simply on will, but on debt, on obligation, on contracts signed in distant rooms. And that lesson reached far beyond one plantation, because history has a way of repeating its structures in new forms. Some chains are fastened to wrists, others are written in contracts. And history shows us both can be just as binding. The ledger did not set her free, but it revealed a truth the master never wanted known, that even the man holding the whip was owned.